How bad is it to want an incentive to encourage you to do a mitzvah? Well, according to Rashi, certain mitzvahs are designed that way from the start. Nachdem wir die Torah sagt an den Dim von Ola und Kerem Revoi, after the Torah tells us about the laws of how we have to wait before we can have the fruit of a tree or of a vine, steht in Pasuk, then the Pasuk says this, Vashona hachamishis, in the 5th year, Deichlas Pirio, you can eat the fruits, Lo hoisif lochem tuvu asoi, and that will add to your produce, and Hashem Elokechem Hashem underwrites it. Is Rashi matik divert lo hoisif lochem tuvu asoi? Rashi takes those words, to add to your produce, and he explains that it's mefarish, ha-mitzvah tishmeru, if you observe this mitzvah, then the observance of this mitzvah will increase your take-home. Should be schara, because in the reward of this mitzvah, ani mavorech lachem peres sanatias, the Eibishter promises a brocha in the fruits of our planting. So what's Rashi trying to tell us? With Pashtus lernt men, as Rashi kommt bavornen. So it would seem, according to most of the commentators on Rashi, that really what Rashi is out to clarify over here is, as iverta lo yisif lachem tuvu asoi, those words that say to add to the yield of your produce, are not the immediate follow-on from telling us that in the 5th year we're permitted to eat the fruit, because it would be illogical to say, now that you're allowed to eat the fruit, that's going to bring you bracha. Rather, Rashi is showing us that this promise of a great yield of our produce is actually linked to the earlier psukim, which told us about what we're supposed to do and how we observe this mitzvah. Mitzvah hazos shetishmeru, as Rashi says, this mitzvah, if you keep it, will produce this great result that you'll have a tremendous yield of your product. Okay, so that makes sense, and we get what Rashi has to tell us, so we shouldn't misread the pasuk. But the way Rashi tells it to us seems a bit strange. It is odd that Rashi uses so much language to convey what should be a fairly straightforward point. Surely he could have just summarized, similar to how the Even Ezra says, that those words that you're going to get, this return on investment, should be linked to the part of the Torah that tells us that for the first 3 years, and then the 4th year, it's off bounds, and then you've got to dedicate your fruit as a kind of a holy thing, or something like that. Or like the Rashbam says, you will get that reward of the extra yield of your produce if you listen to what I say. Why does Rashi give us so much information? And maybe you're going to want to try and squeeze out an explanation that Rashi is actually explaining what the nature of the bracha is. What does it mean that there'll be a great yield of your produce? That the Eibishter is blessing the fruits that you will plant. Even that, Rashi could have said much more succinctly. I quote the words of the pasuk that you're going to have an abundant yield, and then say, in reward for this mitzvah, I bless the yield of your fruits. Why is Rashi using so much language and apparently even repeating himself to say, this mitzvah that you will keep? Tiyeh will be to add the yield, and then again say because in the reward for that mitzvah, I'm going to bless your fruits. Okay. Besides that, there are a few words in Rashi that should catch our eye. Rashi, some of the nuances in Rashi are as follows. Aleph, why does he say this mitzvah? Who needs that word hazois, this mitzvah? Obviously, we're talking about this mitzvah. As Asher Old Gizok mitzvah, had Rashi kept it generic and said, when you keep the mitzvah, or any other variation without that word hazois, we would have known that you're talking about this mitzvah. Because that's what the pasuk is speaking about. Why would you imagine it's any other mitzvah that you have to qualify and say hazois? Also, what does it mean? I'm blessing the fruits of your planting. Why is Rashi using different language to what the pasuk said, which was simply tvuasai, your produce? Maybe it's because Rashi wants to clarify that we're not talking about the yield of your fields like grain, but rather the yield of your vines. And maybe you'll say it's linked to the beginning of the pasuk, which is speaking about planting fruit trees. So then Rashi could have said that the Eibishter will bless your fruits, other hanatiyas, all your plantings. Why does Rashi need a double expression? The fruits of your planting. Before we can answer any of that, let's look what Rashi says next. Weiter, Rashi continues. Rabbi Kiva taught, and he taught regularly. Here, the Torah is addressing the Yetzer Hara. How so? That a person shouldn't argue. For 4 years, I'm investing in my agriculture with nothing in return. So we address and say, calm down, don't worry. In the 5th year, the Eibishter is going to give you extra yield and bracha, and that will compensate. So the question is, why is Rashi bringing this up? Then a Mefarshim, so the Mefarshim want to say as the mitfayin for Rashi, that Rashi is trying to answer. Why is it that the placement of when we're told about the reward that there'll be this great yield of our produce, why it's after he tells us that in the 5th year you're allowed to eat the fruits. Because logically, it should have already told us about the reward when it described the mitzvah in the first place, because after all, the reward is for the mitzvah, not for the eating. So therefore Rashi quotes Rabbi Akiva as because once you hear that it's the 5th year that you get to eat, that's when you realize, oh my, for 4 years I'm going to be investing without seeing a return. Because the person has to self-discipline and not partake of the fruits for the first 4 years. And therefore he's quoting, Rabbi Akiva says, well, you know what? That amount you're going to get in the 5th year is going to be so abundant that it's going to compensate for the 4 years that you missed. Okay, so apparently Rashi is just explaining the placement of these words in the pasuk. But that doesn't really solve for why Rashi quoted Rabbi Akiva. Because remember, Rashi is explaining the simple explanation of the pasuk, and the fact that the reward was not quoted right at the beginning when the mitzvah was introduced is not a question according to Pshat, because usually when the Torah does describe the reward for a mitzvah, it's usually at the conclusion of the topic of that particular mitzvah, which would have worked exactly here. First, the Torah gives us all of the details of the mitzvah, how a person has to conduct themselves when they're planting trees. That for 3 years you're not allowed to eat. And then and then in the 4th year you have to designate those fruits as holy and you have to eat them Yerushalayim. And then part of the mitzvah is only in the 5th year are you permitted to eat the fruits. And then once you've told us all of the detail of the mitzvah, it is the most logical thing that now the Torah will tell us what you get as a reward. That the Eibishter is going to give you a tremendous return on investment. It's not a big question that Rashi has to address. So why is he quoting Rabbi Akiva? Besides, we also, as we frequently do, have to ask, if Rashi wanted us to know that we're addressing the Yetzer Hara, why is it important to know that it was Rabbi Akiva who taught this? Rashi tut us not dort for das is meisiv in avodas hapirush, as the Rebbe has taught us multiple times. The only reason that Rashi would include the name of the Baal HaMaimer is to help us understand the message more clearly. So why do we have to know that it's Rabbi Akiva here? And not just that it's Rabbi Akiva, or Nochmer, in dem Gufes Rashi Medaik, Hoya Rabbi Akiva Omer. Rashi doesn't just say this is Rabbi Akiva speaking, but that he said it on a regular basis. As Rabbi Akiva ständig sagen dem Maimer, that Rabbi Akiva would repeat this saying often. How's that going to help us understand the topic more clearly? In the Maimer Guf of Rashi bring from Rabbi Akiva's nicht verstandig. And then one other thing we have to ask, and this is possibly the overarching question about Rabbi Akiva's contention, is that there are many mitzvahs which the Torah tells us what the reward for them would be. And Rashi is by nicht meforish as the time was Torah is maftiach schar mitzvah is keneged Yetzer Hara. And in none of those mitzvahs does Rashi say, well, the reason the Torah had to tell us the reward is because you're going to grapple with this mitzvah. The Yetzer Hara is going to have a hard time, so we address it with the reward. Implying that if not for the incentive, the Yetzer Hara would not permit us to fulfill this mitzvah. So why here? Why? What is it that makes it so compelling that this particular reward is anders von an anders mitzvah, different to any other reward for any other mitzvah, and is to address the contention of the Yetzer Hara. Why don't we just simply say, well, because the person deserves reward because they worked so hard for 4 years without seeing the fruit of their labors. So Bishlama, by the parasha from your fast Torah, there is another occasion where the Torah addresses the Yetzer Hara that makes a lot of sense, and that is the so-called beautiful captive in the scenario of war. That makes sense that when the Torah tells us that the person who finds this non-Jewish woman in the battlefield is permitted to take her as a wife, there it makes sense as that Rashi should tell us the Torah is addressing the Yetzer Hara. Because Rashi says, we know what's going to happen in the heat of war, that a person, if they're not permitted to conduct themselves in certain ways, are going to just do so even if it's not allowed. In other words, Rashi is telling us that the Torah means that this woman should be forbidden. But the Eibishter permits it because of extenuating circumstances. And if you have something which is forbidden, but the Eibishter is giving you license under extenuating circumstances, that implies that the Yetzer Hara is being addressed. But when it comes to rewards for mitzvah, totally different topic, totally different approach. As we've seen, there are numerous mitzvahs that are recorded with their rewards. And thus say mitzvahs, and the concept of being rewarded for mitzvahs is a fundamental Jewish belief. As the Eibishter gets mitzvahs, so why is this one singled out for the mitzvah von Ola and Keren Revoy as that the reward for delaying our participation or partaking of the fruits that we plant, that's the one that's addressing the Yetzer Hara. Why? And the last piece of the puzzle is shortly after this, Rashi addresses the fact that the Torah says Ani Hashem. Onis Mefarish explains, what does it mean Ani Hashem? Ani Hashem maftiach al kach v'ne'emen lishmar avtachasi. I am the Eibishter who promises this reward, and you can rely on me to fulfill my promises. Isn't it move on? That's also unusual. Because the Lashon Haragil b'Pirish Rashi kigen does because a ne'emen l'shalem schar. Usually, when Rashi does address Ani Hashem, he says, reliable to reward. Why is Rashi adding more information over here? Ani Hashem, ha-maftiach al kach, I'm the Eibishter who promises this, v'ne'emen lishmar avtachasi, and I'm reliable to fulfill my promise. Nachmer, furthermore, that's not only more words than Rashi normally says, it's a different message to what Rashi normally says. It's not what Rashi would typically say, that the Eibishter is reliable to reward us for doing the right things, but that the Eibishter is reliable to fulfill his promises. Why is that relevant? And Rashi is actually changing tack from what he said in this particular mitzvah a little earlier, that I'm going to reward you. And now it starts bringing in the word promises. Why the change? Shlomo Abirbo says, so the argument, that the answer to all of this hinges on one principle. The Shaila Pasuk of Sashi Kumfarim from Bifurushe is, let's re-examine what question about the Pasuk is Rashi looking to address. So, not as we originally thought, that Rashi is just bothered by where in the story this promise of extra yield comes. As we mentioned, that is already not an issue because it's typical to give the reward at the end of the entire presentation. Now, in the Pirish HaTevis, Rashi is more bothered by the words. Had the Torah only wanted to tell us there is a reward for this mitzvah of Orla, and this is the reward, then the word should have been, fulfill this mitzvah in order that I then give you great return on your investment. Or the Eibishter could say, and I will add to the yield of your produce. But the fact that the Torah says to add, so do this to add, that implies from the mitzvah that this is not just a response to the mitzvah, it's the goal of the mitzvah. Don't eat the fruit for 3 years, so that it will, not that so that you earn a reward, so that will add value to the return on your investment. Do these steps so that it will give you a greater return on your investment. Like the language, remember Shabbos, so that you keep it holy and sanctified. It's not a reward. If you keep Shabbos, it will be holy. The purpose of keeping Shabbos is to sanctify it. Rashi picks up on that lehoisif, and he says that compels us to explain as the pshat in pasuk is mitzvah hazois. The Torah is highlighting that this mitzvah shetishmeru, that you will keep it. You should keep it in order that you get greater yield on your produce. Even though normally the way that we're supposed to fulfill the mitzvah is because the Eibishter said so. But by their mitzvah zog Torah, in this particular context, the Torah tells us as ir shmira is megzain milechatchila mita kavana loisif lachem tvasei. Here's a mitzvah that you are permitted to, or maybe even expected to, do so that you'll get reward. That's what's incredibly interesting about this pasuk. Which is why Rashi has to add more words to his explanation so we get the message. The message in the parasha that says it will create a return on investment, a yield of your produce, it's not just telling us what the reward is. Rather, the Torah is helping us determine what our intention should be in fulfilling this mitzvah. The Torah is giving license to do a mitzvah in order to get more back. Which means Rashi is illustrating two key points to us. Number one, is not telling us, describing the reward, rather it is mandating the attitude of the person doing the mitzvah. You should do this mitzvah in order that you get more back. And then Rashi also tells us why you need to be thinking this way. Because a person, why do you think you're going to get more back? Because that's what's going to happen. You're going to get more back. Because the Eibishter underwrites it. Should be schara ani mevarach lachem peres hanatiyos. Because in the reward for this mitzvah, I am going to bless the fruits of your planting. That raises another question. Let's say we went with the first way we understood this, which was the simplest, that David is just describing what the reward for this mitzvah is. Then, as mentioned, it wouldn't be surprising that the reward is only described at the end of the presentation. But now we're saying it's not a description of the reward, it's a description of the intention. So why is it at the end? It should actually be at the beginning. Rashi has now told us that is there to shape the intention of the person when they step up to do the mitzvah. Surely then these words should have been around about the time and space where we speak about doing the mitzvah. So don't allow yourself to eat the fruit. So that we'll know, don't eat the fruit because your intention should be to get more later. So Rashi explains why these words appear later in the pasuk by telling us not as the pasuk said Tuvu Asay that you'll get produce, but saying the fruit of your planting. What's he telling us with that? Rashi is telling us the fact that the Torah placed these words about the promise and the intention of getting more yield from our produce by fulfilling Orla after telling us that we eat the fruit in the 5th year. The Torah is telling us not just that there will be a bracha, but how the bracha will manifest. It's neat, not as not only what we would have expected, that the Eibishter will bless the produce to actually be abundant. The bracha is beyond that. That even when those fruits are now on the tree and ready to eat in the 5th year, there'll still be bracha and increase at that point, which is unusual. And in Mevorach Lechem Peiros Anatiyas, Rashi is telling us, I'm going to bless the ready-to-pick fruits to have bracha in them. Similar to what Rashi says in Parshas Behar with the brachas, that there is a bracha not only in the yield of produce, but also in how it is inside of our system. And that's what Rashi is highlighting for us. It's not a generic bracha that you'll have more return of your produce, but that the produce itself will be blessed. But we still have a question. Why is this mitzvah unique? That this is specifically the mitzvah is Aleph Torah Zokton as that the Torah is giving us license to intend to do this mitzvah in order to get reward. That's so unusual. And and how come the actual reward itself is different to usual rewards? Normal rewards are you're going to get more back. This is a reward that says even the quality of the fruit is going to be blessed while it's on the tree. What's so unusual about this mitzvah? Says Rashi, bring the Farash in the Maimon for Rabbi Akiva. Says, I'll tell you, Rabbi Akiva explains what is so unusual about the mitzvah, which is why its reward is so unusual too, and its attitude is so unusual. Rabbi Akiva tells us we're dealing with the Yetzer Hara who might want to impede us doing this mitzvah. The Baal says there's schwer zu mekayim sein the mitzvah because it's going to be a very difficult mitzvah to fulfill. But a mensch kennt doch teinen aber schon mit star by chinam. Because a person will complain, you want me to work for 4 years without seeing any return? So therefore we allowed, similar to the Yefas Torah, where we allow something, to contend with the Yetzer Hara. So what do we allow? We allow you to think about and intend to receive the reward that's coming later. And because we have to satisfy the Yetzer Hara, the Eibishter's promise is an unusual bracha that even the Yetzer Hara will say, you know what, it's worth holding out. Which is exactly why Rashi interprets the words Ani Hashem as Ani Hashem and the Eibishter who promises and is reliable to keep this promise to give you these brachas. It's not good enough to have the usual promise. You can trust me that I will reward you. Well, the only reason the person is doing this mitzvah is because they want the reward. So it doesn't help now to say, and I'll give you the reward. Because if the person is already fulfilling the mitzvah, that means they've overcome the obstacle of the Yetzer Hara that did not want them to do the mitzvah, because they obviously see the value in the reward. So there's no value in telling us, and I'm going to reward you. That's why Rashi says the Eibishter's promise over here is not I will reward you, but I promise this. When you know that the Eibishter underwrites this reward, and that the Eibishter is reliable to keep his promises, that's enough to convince the Yetzer Hara to get on board. But the child, the student who's really on his game, will still have a question. The sharp student raises this question. One second, why is this mitzvah so radically different from all other mitzvahs? To allow us to intend to be rewarded. And then just not just any reward, but an unusual, supernatural kind of reward. Und das Salzlieb einem, was ist in Azar Schwala Matziv, as the einzige Weg zu Peilen ist zu Pavonen connected to her. And this is going to be because there might be somebody on the fringe of the community who is so spiritually disconnected that they need the carrot of the reward to get them to do the mitzvah. So all of us are going to be told to do the mitzvah this way. So that's why Rashi has to tell us who the Baal HaMaimer is. It's Rabbi Akiva. Remember what he represents? This is Rabbi Akiva who says that to love your fellow Jew is a fundamental principle of Judaism. And we know that Rabbi Akiva was a person who consistently looked for a way to justify merit on behalf of the Jewish people. So when you go with Rabbi Akiva's perspective, which is to find the good in a fellow Jew and to be able to assist a fellow Jew, is a founding principle of Torah. That explains why the Torah would be concerned about every Jew, even the Jew on the fringe. And why the Torah would even come up with a plan for the Jew who needs his Yetzer Hara to be addressed. And that's why Rashi doesn't just say Rabbi Akiva said, but he regularly said, that Rabbi Akiva would regularly repeat this message. Was das weiß, als in der Bavonisch von Dibber Keneged Yitzhahara hat sich Aris gesagt, als Sach, was ist beim Yuchud verbunden mit Muhusam Alos Shel Rabbi Akiva, because effectively what Rashi is illustrating over here is that this message is something which conveys what Rabbi Akiva stands for and what he's all about. Und der Pfarrer hat Rabbi Akiva gechazert wegen der Größe Te'eles davon. That's why Rabbi Akiva regularly spoke about this, because it represents what he cares about and what he believes in. And it's also a reflection on his own life experience, because Rabbi Akiva hat die erste 40 Jahre von seinem Leben nicht gelernt kein Torah. Rabbi Akiva did not learn Torah for the first 40 years of his life. Erst dann, wenn man hat ihm zugesagt, schar, Torah. But when he was told that there'd be great reward for learning Torah, he's gegangen lernen, and then he went to learn. Kommt aus, als Rabbi Akiva is given kein der Matzah von Harei Arba Shanim Anim Star Boy Chinam. So Rabbi Akiva's life reflects in a way what's going on over here with the 4 years of toiling without returns. Sein Gehen lernen Torah ist given verbunden mit der Wegwerfen die erste 40 Jahre von sein Leben. When Rabbi Akiva engages to learn Torah, he's effectively denouncing the 40 years that preceded that. Durch Gehen lernen Torah ist Madgish, als friedliche Jahren sein mit Starba Chinam seinen umsiste Jahren. By now investing his entire life in learning Torah, Rabbi Akiva is making a statement that the first 40 years of his life were essentially wasted. It was toil for nothing. Like the person was saying, I've been looking after my field now for 4 years and I can't eat a fruit. And there is gegangen Torah to the Baschar, and we know that the motivation that got Rabbi Akiva going was the anticipation of incentive, of a reward. And the fact that his initial interest in Torah learning was for an ulterior motive did not stop him from becoming the greatest scholar that the entire Gemara is based on. That's why Rabbi Akiva frequently repeated this message, that the Torah addresses the Yetzer Hara, because it was familiar to him. It was because of the promised reward that got Rabbi Akiva to start learning Torah. And that's what turned him into the great, illustrious Rabbi Akiva. There's one last point that we have to clarify, at least from a perspective of spirituality. Safe is die Neutigkeit von der Beteiligung gegen die Yitzhahara, bloß from the same mitzvah von Eden, welche seinen Gorbisch Matzav. At the end of the day, if we have to address a Yitzhahara, we're talking about a small fraction of the Jewish community who needs the Yitzhahara spoken to. So why is this the way that the mitzvah is presented to every single Jew? And I know from that every single Jew has to approach this mitzvah, because remember, it's the kavanah, it's the intention of the mitzvah. So every single Jew, even one who's not grappling with the Yetzer Hara, has to go with this approach of, I have to consider my Yetzer Hara. Is the beer in them, the explanation of Bipnimius and Yonim is the Pirush HaPnimi in Dibra Torah Keneged Yetzer Hara. The deeper meaning of addressing the Yetzer Hara is, as the mitzvah is in Yonav as Torah will dem mit Iber machen dem Yetzer Hara, that the goal of Torah is to transform the Yetzer Hara, not only to outsmart or overcome the Yetzer Hara. Like we say in Shema, that the goal is to love the Eibusha not only with the Yetzer Tov, but the Yetzer Hara as well. The goal of Yiddishkeit is to reach a point that our Yetzer Hara wants to do the mitzvahs. That's why we have a mitzvah where the intention of the mitzvah is to get something out of it. Because the message is, when you're tackling the Yetzer Hara and then you get it on board, you transform the Yetzer Hara, that is the ultimate return on investment that they was just, so to speak, planted in this world in order to harvest. As we know, the pasuk tells us that many farms, many fields worth of produce are in the strength of the ox that pulls the plow. As the verav to voice a sofa ve'ile rav v'kedusha. The spiritual meaning of that is that the abundance of holiness in the world is actually the result of capturing and transforming the animal within us, the nefesh habamis. The roof is, and there's a good reason for it. Because to be able to get the Yetzer Hara and the Nefesh Habamis on side is difficult, it's uncomfortable. As long as I'm serving the Eibishter just using my neshama, that's a very pleasurable, deep experience. Aber die Avoide von Bir Nefesh Habamis fordert die Gier zu durchbrechen dem hellen Wesen von Nefesh Habamis durch Iskafia. But to convert my Nefesh Habamis, that's hard work. That takes the breaking of habits, takes Iskafia, the compulsion of the Nefesh Habamis to get on board. Und der Rebbe muss früher sein, der Zar von Abba Shana, was der Nefesh Habamis hat genickt in Anof und der Tvor, and therefore this is the template, Orla. There are 4 years where the Nefesh Habamis does not get any benefit, does not feel why this is worthwhile. But that's what gets the Nefesh Habamis on board. Und durch der Iskafe wird noch Ishapcha. Once we are able to compel the Nefesh Habamis to align with what the Eibishter wants, even if it's through incentive, then that eventually converts the Nefesh Habamis to be aligned with what the Eibishter wants. Until eventually it's the Nefesh Habamis that actually gives us the greatest nachas, the greatest capacity to serve and do what the Eibishter wants. And so we should not be afraid of the fact that there's a Yetzer Hara lurking in the background that maybe wants to interfere and needs a little bit of a carrot on a stick in order to go in the direction that the Eibishter wants, because that's where the greatness and power actually lies.